Hi, this presentation is all about Rubens and how he absorbs different artistic traditions. So we're going to jump right in by looking at one of the mature works by Rubens. What you see here is Diana and Callisto. According to the story told by Ovid in Metamorphosis, Callisto is one of the unmarried girls in Diana's entourage. One day, Jupiter catches sight of her and disguises himself as Diana so that Callisto won't be alarmed, and in this disguise, he rapes her and makes her pregnant. Rubens depicts the moment that her pregnancy is revealed. You can see her there on the left-hand side, bowed down, covering her body. We begin here for two reasons. Reason number one, it's characteristic of his style. Dramatic, sensuous, emphasizing movement, a new kind of naturalism. The treatment of the figures is also emblematic of his style. They're full, they're soft, they're fleshy. A second reason for beginning here is because it's an example of how he absorbs artistic traditions. And that's because this image is based on Titian's earlier version of the same scene. Titian was one of the greatest Venetian artists of the 16th century, known for his loose brushwork and sketchiness that gave movement to his pieces. Of course, there are similarities between the two works, but there are also notable differences. So mood is one thing that's very different. You can see in Titian's version, Diana is pointing to Callisto, who's cowering, trying to hide her body, whereas in Rubens's version, there's a lot more compassion, and Diana is actually reaching out like a mother would reach for a child, or a father would reach for a child, and the nymphs are rushing to cover her with drapery. In terms of brushwork, Rubens has a sketchiness, has a fluidity with his brushwork, but it's slightly more controlled than Titian's earlier example. The contour lines are slightly more defined. Another difference is the treatment of landscape, whereas in Titian's earlier version, landscape is almost an afterthought, just peeping through in the center of the composition there. For Rubens, landscape becomes a subject. It is a character in this epic moment in the story. The use of landscape, the slightly more contoured lines, are indicators to other artistic influences that Rubens absorbed and that we can now take a look at. So Rubens's earliest training came from the artists who were working in Antwerp at the end of the 16th century, beginning of the 17th century. And two figures I'd like to look at are Tobias Verhecht and Otto van Veen. Tobias Verhecht is important because he teaches Rubens how to use landscape as a setting for stories with a moral lesson or a proverb. So this is Venus, landscape with Venus and Adonis from 1600. Here, the landscape that you can see is an imaginary one, depicting a soaring alpine view with tall pines and a rushing stream, and there are castles there on the tops of these mountains. The practice of placing biblical or mythological scenes in a landscape and using that landscape to reinforce moral messages in a work is something that Rubens absolutely picks up on. We can see that here because, according to the story, Venus advises Adonis not to hunt dangerous boar, but he ignores her and he is slain. So here we see Venus giving counsel to Adonis, and her guidance and her wisdom is reinforced by the ordered gardens and the strong buildings that we see behind. So that is what Rubens learns, one of the things that Rubens learns from someone like Tobias Verhecht. Another important influence is Otto van Veen. So Rubens works as he's an apprentice, he's working in the studio of Otto van Veen. And from Otto van Veen, in terms of painting and composition, he learns about the representation of a body, he learns about the importance of gesture, the importance of pose. And you can see something of how Otto van Veen treats bodies, gestures, and pose in his version of the Amazons and the Scythians that dates to 1629. More importantly, perhaps, is that Otto von Fane has a vast collection of engravings of works in Rome, works in Italy. He's got a huge collection of these different engravings of sites, famous works of art, and particular buildings and designs that Rubens can then study and reproduce himself. So let's take a look at what some of those things are. In terms of the engravings, these are the first things that Rubens has access to before he even goes to Italy in the 1600s. So, an engraving that he had access to would be something like this, Raimondi's reproduction of Raphael's Adam and Eve. What you see on the right-hand side is Rubens's own copy of that same image. So Rubens knows what's happening in Rome. He knows the works of Michelangelo and Raphael, but he only knows them from engravings. Part of his motivation to go to Italy in 1600 is to see these works on site, to see, for example, the Laocoon in person, to absorb it completely, to study it completely, to understand it completely, and to sketch it. So you can see here one of the sketches that Rubens produced whilst he was in Rome in the first decade of the 17th century. We know that he looked at things like antique statuary. We also know that he looked at the works in the Vatican, Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican, for example, looking at their colour and their scale, learning how eloquent a layout can be, how symmetry could be used symbolically to convey moral messages, for example, and likewise, how architecture could be used to set and frame a work and enhance messages about order in a work. Another artist who he studied closely was Michelangelo. So this is Michelangelo's Prophet Daniel that dates to about 1508 to 1512. And from this, Rubens learnt about the gravity of figures, their mental and spiritual energy, their potential for intellectual greatness, and their potential for sin. He's studying these works, he's sketching these works. Sometimes he's just pretty much copying these works. So what you see here is a copy of Michelangelo's Leda and the Swan. The original, the original doesn't actually exist anymore. That was lost. But this is what you see here is a 1530 copy of the piece. And on the left-hand side, you can see Rubens's own version from 1601 to 1602. Sometimes what Rubens is doing is this, what is, almost a complete copy. Sometimes what Rubens chooses to do, like this, the Battle of the Amazon and the Greeks, is to take known prototypes and to embed those in other images. So here, if you look at the male wrestling with the two female bodies, or just off-center on the left-hand side at the lower register of the painting, that recalls directly the Laocoon. And that is something that other artists and connoisseurs would all be able to recognize at the time. So that's a very deliberate thing, a deliberate kind of copy, cut and paste that Rubens is doing. In addition to studying the works of Renaissance artists, Rubens also sees contemporary works by Carracci, works by Caravaggio, that had just recently been unveiled in the palazzi and the churches in Rome. These are, of course, works of the Counter-Reformation. They're very different to these images by high Renaissance artists. And from people like Carracci, people like Caravaggio, Rubens learns how to tell a story more cogently, more clearly, how to clarify the composition, reduce the number of characters in a scene, and also to depict figures in a more realistic proportion. This is what he studies in Rome. Perhaps more important were the works of Venetian artists that he studied during his sojourn in Italy in the first decade of the 17th century. So two people I'd like us to just take a moment to look at are Titian and Tintoretto. So this is Tintoretto's Last Supper from 1592. Rubens picks up from works like this the importance of, or rather how to create a forceful composition, how to use body language to convey a narrative, and how light can be symbolic. When we think about light, we automatically think about Caravaggio, but here Tintoretto uses light as an actor in the scene. Compositionally, it draws our attention to the sharp diagonal, but it is also used to give mass, albeit kind of ethereal mass, to the angels. You can see the light flickering off the edges of the holy figures and angels. So light here is symbolic. It's symbolic of divine presence, and this idea that light and landscape could be subjects in an image is very much present in Venetian art of the 16th century. Perhaps the most important influence was Titian. So this is Titian's version of the Assumption of the Virgin from 1516. This Rubens saw whilst he was in Italy in the early 1600s. And we can see the impact it had if we compare it to Rubens's own version of the Assumption that was painted in Antwerp 20 years after he'd seen it first in Venice. There are differences, but the overall organisation of the composition very much recalls Titian's earlier work. And as a real testament to Rubens's passion, love, admiration for Titian, we just need to think about the number of works that Rubens had in his own collection. When Rubens died, there were 8 paintings by Titian in his collection, 2 sketches, and 33 copies, direct copies, that he had made of Titian's work. I hope with all of this, bit of a whistle stop, but I hope this has given you an idea for how Rubens absorbs these different artistic traditions and how these different elements contribute to his own particular style and his own interpretation of biblical, mythological, and secular narratives. We've got the treatment of line, the treatment of the brushwork, of the contours of bodies, the naturalism in the bodies, the use of a landscape and light as a setting that would convey or help convey moral messages. We've got the influence of Renaissance artists when it comes to adding in that more linear style. We've got the impact of Venetian artists as well.